Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 7th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We are in the 3rd week of this course where we are discussing classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. And if you look at the last lecture, there we have discussed classical sociology, the aspect of evolution through the works of Hegel, Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Louis Morgan, Edward Teller, and then we have discussed how change is natural, change is directional, change is immanent, change is continuous. Okay? Up to this we have discussed, and in this lecture we are going to discuss change is necessary, change proceeds from uniform causes, and the metaphor of growth, metaphor as progress, and so on we will discuss today. Okay? And in fact, these elements of social evolution have been narrated by Robert A. Nisbet, and how these also can be challenged. Okay? We have discussed change is natural, change is directional, change is immanent, and change is continuous in the last lecture. And in today's lecture, we are going to discuss these two. Okay? How change is necessary and change proceeds from uniform causes, and how in toto all these 6 aspects can be challenged. Okay? When I say, when Nisbet argued that change is necessary because social development was directional, immanent and continuous, okay, it had logically had to have still another attribute, that is called necessity. We have already discussed how change is directional, how change is immanent, how change is continuous, and so on. Okay. Now, as a logical sequence, you will find logical imperative, that you will find that change is also necessary. Necessity is one of those golden words in the 19th century social sciences, and nowhere more golden than in the theory of development. It is easy to caricature Herbert Spencer's resounding declaration of the beneficent necessity of progress, but the fact remains that he was saying with perhaps unique flourish only what each of the other titans of social evolutionism said in Spencer's age, Herbert Spencer. Here again it is categorically imperative to remind ourselves that no one of the social evolutionists was speaking of history in the aggregate when he spoke of necessity, nor was any of them blind to the existence of the causal and fortuitous. Each of them, Marx with capitalism, Louis Morgan with polity, property and family, Tocqueville with democracy, Comte with human knowledge and so on, was but declaring that a given sequence of development was necessary to the nature of the system or systems that they were studying. Free of the accidental and the merely causal, it was necessary that a given institution have developed through time, as comparative researchers showed that it had in fact developed, and this was the argument of evolutionary necessity. Look at, for example, the works of Hegel, philosophy of history, where you will find that it is the underlying development of the idea of freedom that Hegel is concerned with philosophy of history, just as Comte is interested in the idea of knowledge, Newman in the idea of Christianity, and Morgan in the idea of government, of property and of the family. For example, Hegel tells us that development is a property of organized natural objects. Their existence presents itself not as an exclusively dependent one subjected to external changes, but as one which expands itself in virtue of an internal unchangeable principle, a simple essence whose existence, that is as a germ, is primarily simple, but which subsequently develops a variety of parts but that become involved with other objects and consequently live through a continuous process of changes. For Auguste Comte, the development of knowledge from the religious, from the theological to the metaphysical to the positivistic or scientific stage was necessary in its pattern because of the very pattern of the human mind itself. It was necessary, as Comte argued, that physics precede chemistry, that chemistry precede biology, and that biology precede sociology in the filiation of the sciences, necessary because of the successive degrees of conceptual dependence. And it is necessary, he tells us, Comte tells us repeatedly in the positive philosophy that that sociology now passed from its metaphysical stage to its positivistic or scientific stage, necessary because of the pattern of development. Even Charles Darwin saw necessity in progressive development. One more instance of the persistence in his mind of essentially 18th century conceptions side by side with a theory of natural selection that could ill afford them. Although Darwin writes that there is no very good evidence of any innate tendency towards progressive development in the species, still Darwin concluded such progressive development may be regarded as necessarily following from the action of the principle of natural selection, which always he assures us that works towards the good of each being. The result is that each creature tends to become more and more improved in relation to its conditions, and this improvement inevitably leads to the gradual advancement of the organization of the greater number of living beings throughout the world. Necessity means, in short, logical necessity. Okay? When I say, when Nisbet suggested necessity, he always tries to look at logical necessity. Okay? That is how transformation occurs and so on, that is how transition occurs and so on. Necessity means, in short, logical necessity, logical in the sense of the relation of the development of the structure of the thing that is developing. Okay? Maybe it is capitalism or Christianity and so on. When St. Augustine introduced this momentous idea into the realm of history, he had behind him, of course, not merely the idea of the all-powerful, all-seeing God of the Jews, but also the idea of necessity he drew from Greek philosophy. Given both, it was possible, and Augustine ceaselessly reiterates this, but when we are dealing with necessity in the 19th century social evolutionary sense, we are dealing quite as we are with respect to directionality, immanence, and continuity. With an entity that has been abstracted, so to speak, with the totality of things. Okay? That these entities, as we have discussed in the last class, that you will find that entity for Hegel is freedom, for Marx is changing economic conditions, for Tocqueville rise of democracy in the West, and so on. Marx, as we know, flattered himself that he had liberated himself from Hegel's priority of the idea, as Nisbet argues, that he had, as it were, turned the matter right side up, making material things prior and fundamental. Let us not question the materialism in the Marxist scheme of things, but no one examining Marx's and Engels' treatment of capitalism and also of feudalism and of the classical system of slavery that they had preceding the others in time can doubt that in each instance it is the idea of capitalism that Marx was dealing with. You see, Marx always tried to look at how matter is prior to the formation of idea, and that is how Marx's materialism tried to reject Hegelian idealism in its totality. Okay? And when we say materialist conception of history, or popularly known as historical materialism, what is historical in historical materialism? I mean, the way various stages of society, various forms of society have come into existence. That is how historical entails how particular forms of society have come into existence and the material conditions under which they have developed, right? Where you may find that apparently eternal or universal forms, they will also disappear in Marxist schema. These apparently universal or eternal social forms may include the state, religion, market, and so on. They just appear to us that they are universal or eternal, but they are not, right? I mean, historically speaking. Okay? Capitalism for Marx has the same kind of abstract reality, the same kind of autonomous structural being that freedom had for Hegel, knowledge for Comte, and the family property kinship units for Louis Morgan. We have seen Marx's insistence that the continuity of the law of motion for economic society cannot be broken by bold lips or legal sentiments. From continuity, it is but a short step to necessity, okay? From continuity to necessity, and we can scarcely be surprised then to find Marx referring to laws and tendencies working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. The nation, Marx goes on, that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. Marx was willing to extend the idea of necessity of development from the constructed system, that is his rendering of capitalism, to the specific areas of historically constituted notions. Okay? Maybe class, maybe property, maybe division of labor, maybe mechanization, and so on. Such extension of the idea of necessity is nevertheless rare. Almost universally, what was deemed necessary was the pattern of change presumed to be inherent within an institution or system rather than in geographical areas. how important Marx's idea of necessity was in his larger scheme of the direction of economic change may be inferred from the quasi-theological debates among Marxists and other revolutionaries in Russia just before and even during the October Revolution of 1917 concerning whether Russia could pass directly from its feudal stage to socialism or must instead have an intervening non-capitalist period. For all the social evolutionists, necessity was a cardinal element of what they deemed to be a scientific theory of change. Louis Morgan, for example, at the very beginning of his Ancient Society, emphasizes that, stresses that all of the stages of development set forth in that book called Ancient Society, for society in general and for each of the three institutions he features, namely family, property and government, are necessary. They are necessary because they are natural, that is natural to the entity involved. Those entities we have discussed, freedom for Hegel, changing economic conditions for Marx, social dynamics, knowledge system for Comte, rise of democracy in the West for Tocqueville, and so on, or Christianity for Newman, right. And these three features that Louis Morgan tries to point out, that family, property and government, okay, they are necessary. They are necessary because they are natural, that is natural to the entity involved. So too in Newman's great treatise treatise was necessity stressed. Okay. All that has happened in Christianity for Newman has been necessary, as he was replying to critics of Christianity somewhat as St. Augustine had replied to critics in the 5th century. But whereas Augustine's adversaries had the condition of Rome in mind, Newman's had the condition of Christianity before them. How it was asked? Could the vast, differentiated, complex and affluent thing that Christianity was in the 19th century possibly be reconciled with the simplicity that Christianity manifests in the words of the early apostles? Through development was Newman's answer. Development as necessary as the growth of any living thing. From apostolic simplicity to the differentiation of our own day, Newman declared that there has been a single line of development, an unfolding of latency into actuality as necessary as it has been natural to Christian dogma. Tocqueville, whose obsession was democracy, its properties and its development through time, wrote of the revolution in France, French Revolution of 1789, chance as Tocqueville wrote, that chance played no part whatever in the outbreak of the revolution. Though it took the world by surprise, it was the inevitable outcome of a long period of gestation, the abrupt and violent conclusion of a process in which 6 generations had played intermittent part. Even if it had not taken place, the old social structure would nonetheless have been shattered everywhere sooner or later. So, starting about 1918, where Marxists to write about the revolution in Russia. Okay? Whatever may have been the crimes of England, she will be the unconscious tool of bringing about that revolution. Okay? That is what Marx wrote in the first Indian War of Independence, that it is necessary. Okay? Necessary, when I say French Revolution of 1789, it was necessary, right? Okay? Change is necessary. when I said the struggle for India's independence from the colonial rule, it was necessary, right. Okay. These are historically conditioned. Okay. That is why I tried to give you the example from the first Indian War of Independence by Marx, when he wrote, it is not the crimes of England that it is not to look at that what England has done to countries like India, but at the same time can we survive, can civilization survive its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia, including India, right. That is why he went on to describe Asiatic mode of production and so on. Okay. Anyway, that is a different matter altogether. I am not going to, we are not going to discuss these things here. And finally, we are coming to the point of how change proceeds from uniform causes. Okay. This is the sixth and in many ways boldest of the conceptual elements of the theory of social evolution, so far as the principle of uniformity is concerned. That is what Nisbet argued, and how they can be challenged, we will see a little while later. What Nisbet meant by this, not any uniformity of evolutionary change from area to area, but rather the uniformity of fundamental causes of the change involved in evolution. This is the meaning of the word that reigned in the late 18th century and throughout most of the 19th century. Like everything else that is basic in 19th century theory of social evolution, the principle of uniformity comes most directly from the theory of natural history, and specifically it was James Houghton, himself one of the Scottish philosophers of natural history, who did more than anyone else to give the principles a secure place. James Houghton was a geologist, or more accurately a natural historian of the earth, just as Adam Ferguson was the natural historian of civil society. And it was his contention that the only scientific approach to the study of the history of the earth was through the study of present processes. That is, on the assumption that nature must be consistent and uniform in her working. If you look at this, it could be further assumed that careful study of the processes of change now occurring in the earth would yield all necessary knowledge of the past, in other words, of the forces which had been involved in giving present shape to the surface of the earth and to its atmosphere. The possibility of great, unique, catastrophic events could be conveniently dismissed in favor of a principle that worked solely in terms of the manifest processes of the present. The present is the key to the past. This was the cornerstone on which Houghton and after him Playfair and then the great Charles Lyell built their science of geology. Along with the principle of uniformity went the assumption of vast, almost endless expanses of time, geological time in the past, for only thus could the minute and slow processes of the present, such processes as erosion, be reasonably held to have caused the differences of topography that observation revealed. Even Lyell saw fundamental difficulties with the theory of uniform causes. The evidences of catastrophic events in the geological past were too pressing to be disregarded by a mind as fine as that of Lyell's. It is entirely possible that thoroughgoing uniform causes would have lost its monopolistic position in the physical sciences before it did in fact, had it not been for two conditions. What are those two conditions? Now, the first against Christian fundamentalism, and the second was the publication of Darwin's The Origin of the Species. Christian creationism was, in a manner of speaking, a catastrophic theory of the terrestrial past, and the principles of uniform causes laid down by Houghton and Playfair were admirably designed to cast doubt on catastrophism, not merely by the Cuvier variety, but also by the fundamentalist variety, and with it the whole edifice of Christian dogma. Once the war on Christian fundamentalism began in earnest, and once the fundamentalists began to counterattack the theory of uniform causes, it was inevitable, no doubt, that rationalists and secularists would rally for polemical reasons alone to advancement of a theory that, as Lyell realized, presented great difficulties. And the second and equally powerful reinforcement, if you look at to uniform causes, was Darwin's wholesale acceptance of the theory in conjunction with his doctrine of natural selection. Okay. For what was truly novel in The Origin of the Species was not the idea of the biological evolution, but the argument that biological evolution could be explained through a single uniform process. I mean, that is natural selection for Darwin, right? That always has been in operation in the past and is now in operation and will always be in operation in the future, in perfect accordance with Houghton's principle that the present contains the processes of the past. Darwin declared that the vast, complex and differentiated assemblies of biological types to be seen now in the world was the consequence of a single process. I mean, natural selection, Darwin's natural selection, working through infinitely small, gradual and continuous variations, also to be seen now working in the world. And any reliance upon the possibility of event like mutations of large, more or less unique changes in the past was, Darwin argued, unnecessary. Biological change in time has been the work of uniform processes. I am not suggesting that what Nisbet argues here, that the principle of uniformity arose first in the physical sciences and then was passed to the social disciplines. This would be no more true than the assertion that the idea of evolution itself began first in the physical or biological sciences. These uniform causes, okay, the proponents of social evolutionism propagated, I mean, is as residual an element historically in the theory of social evolution as any other. But there is no gainsaying the immense prestige that was given the whole idea of uniform causes in the biological and social sciences alike by its honoured role in the works of such men as Lyell and Charles Darwin. Household names in obviously Victorian England, virtually canonized names in the powerful secular movement that dominated so much of 19th century thought. It is hard today to realize the degree to which the attack on Christianity obsessed intellectuals of rationalist and utilitarian will, Christianity had much the same position that capitalism was to hold in the first half of the 20th century. It was the enemy in the minds of most intellectuals. Uniform causes above any other single element of the theory of evolution was the perfect point of attack on a theory that made external manipulation its essence and a succession of catastrophes its plot. And the uniform causes that figured so prominently in the works of Horton, Playfair, Lyell, and of course Charles Darwin, figured with equal prominence in the works of the social evolutionists. It had from the beginning, even if we go back to those earliest philosophers of social growth, namely Aristotle, for instance, in his theory of the growth of society and the state, we find interest in the efficient and motor cause, the indwelling persisting cause that activates, as it were, the whole process by which physis manifests itself in time. What else was Saint Augustine's convulsive conflict of the two cities, but dramatization of the uniform conflict in human nature present since the fall? After all, did Augustine not himself explain the marvelous progress that had been man's cultural history on earth through the efficient causes of necessity and human inventiveness, both of them present through mankind's epic sojourn on earth? The idea of uniform causes or the idea of uniformitarianism was a powerful one in 18th century natural history. As Nisbet argues here that Horton has been named a geologist only by our own present time. He was in fact and regarded himself as a natural historian, doing with the earth exactly what his contemporary Adam Smith was doing with the economic system and what across the channel Rousseau was doing with human institutions, generally explaining their development through ongoing and uniform causes. For Adam Smith, the uniform cause of development was competition, for example. For Rousseau, for example, it was the ceaseless operation of men's individuals' vices that explained the development of culture in time. Mandeville's immensely influential fable of the bees had given to private vices, public benefits, the status of uniform cause in human history. It was, however, Immanuel Kant, who wrote Critique of Pure Reason, a deontological approach and so on, idea for universal history and so on. It was nevertheless Immanuel Kant who probably had most to do with putting the idea of endemic uniform conflict in the form most usable to the study of developmental change. What Kant wrote, idea for a universal history that he wrote in 1784, Kant set forth in the form of a fourth thesis in the following. The means employed by nature to bring about the development of all the capacities of individuals is their antagonism in society, so as this is in the end the cause of a lawful order among individuals. That is what the idea of a universal history, that is what Immanuel Kant wrote in 1784. By this antagonism, Kant is referring to what he calls the unsocial sociability of individuals in association, that is their desire to enter into association combined, however, with their desire to maintain the autonomy of egoism. It is the opposition between these two impulses, both of them grounded deeply in individual's nature, that provides the uniform and timeless dynamic of mankind's ascent from primitive barbarism. This opposition, it is which awakens all individual's powers, thus are taken the first true steps from barbarism to culture. Okay? The emphasis on conflict that we find in Kant and in other German philosophers dealing with human development is not as a myopic and parochial criticism once had it, a consequence of German love for force. Everywhere in 19th century, everywhere in 18th century Europe, France, England, Scotland alike, the demand for some endemic uniform mechanism upon conflict or competition of one kind or other. Okay? How better than by some premised internal conflict to explain the course of mankind's advancement through time? Okay. If Kant had to answer this from Kant and others in the 18th century, it is an easy step to the concept of uniform processes that we find in the 19th century theory of social evolution. Hegel, like Kant, found internal conflict to be the effective cause of the development that Hegel studied in terms of the idea of freedom. Freedom for Hegel is an entity to capture social evolution. Okay? Through the dialectic by which thesis and antithesis is resolved into synthesis, the spirit is at war with itself. Whereas Hegel tells us development in the sphere of nature is a peaceful growth, it is in the sphere of the spirit of a severe, a mighty conflict with itself, in light of the eminently non-peaceful process that Darwin would find the process of natural selection or survival of the fittest to be Hegel's words on the sphere of nature have a certain charm. Please remember one thing, that Darwin of course talked about principle of natural selection, but Darwin in fact borrowed the term survival of the fittest from Herbert Spencer. Okay? The notion of endemic conflict or tension of internal elements as the motivating spring of social evolution was to remain a pervasive one in the 19th century. Marx, as we know, made such conflict an inherent process in economic society. Okay? One that took its origin from the rise of private property, and with it social classes. Class struggle is a vital and constant element of all societies. Marxism declares and will remain such until through long range development of the social order to the final phases of capitalism, both private property and social class have been abolished for once and for all. After this, Marx and Engels argued that the motivation for change and indeed for all subsequent human history would lie in man's individual's consciousness, intellectual and political consciousness. And this individual, the individual's intellectual and political consciousness cannot be independent of the changing modes of production. Okay? Tocqueville too gives a picture of the endemic conflict as the motive power of the development of democracy. Conflict between the values of equality and of achievement. The first, a reflection of the democratic urge towards likeness of social condition. The second, an equally irresistible reflection of the democratic urge toward improvement of one's economic and social status. Tocqueville saw the first as the triumphant one in the long run. Okay. Hence, Tocqueville's picture toward the end of democracy in America of democracy having reached a final condition of standardization, homogeneity and inertia, with all embracing political power having risen out of the passion for social equality. For Comte, the continuing motivation toward change within the developmental process rises from the human psyche itself, with its limitless demands for satisfaction of human needs. And Auguste Comte refers to the individual impulsions which make up the progressive force of the human race, and to that instinct which results from the concurrence of all our natural tendencies and which urges individuals to develop the whole of their life in terms of physical, moral and intellectual as far as their circumstances allow. Given this manifestly inherent, timeless and uniform urge to ambition in the human species, Auguste Comte saw no reason to look for any other source of social change. This human craving for knowledge, status and power served for equality, as Tocqueville mentions, unsocial. Tocqueville quotes Kant that term unsocial sociability as a uniform mechanism of change, a mechanism built into the developing entity, one that rendered superfluous any dependence upon either a providence above or external and unique events below to explain the course of human development. Such, it would appear, are the central conceptual elements of the 19th century theory of social evolution. The naturalness of change to each social institution or system as well as to the whole of society, maybe the directional or trend like character of change, the emanation of change from forces which are internal to it, or the genetic continuity of change, the necessity of change to each social system, continuity, immanent, directional, necessary, there may be and dependence of natural change upon uniform persisting forces throughout time. Okay. These are the concepts fundamental to these are the concepts there. These are the elements fundamental to the theory of social evolution. What we are going to do now, we'll see from elements of social evolution to the idea of progress. Okay, from the concept of social evolution and change that we have discussed in this week, that change is natural, change is directional, change is immanent, change is continuous, change is necessary, and change proceeds from uniform causes. Okay, how they can be challenged, how the notion of progress, it tends to look at the metaphor of maybe metaphor of growth, the metaphor as progress, the modern idea of progress in terms of intellectual modernism, the expansion of metaphor, progress and degeneration and so on. Okay. If we start with the metaphor of growth, what we generally tend to look at the metaphor of growth through the works of Robert A. Nisbet, that of all the metaphors in Western thought on mankind and culture, the oldest, the most powerful and encompassing is the metaphor of growth. Okay. We are going to discuss this holistically. When we say that a culture or institution or nation grows or develops, we have reference to change in time, but to change of a rather special and distinctive type, we are not referring to random and adventitious changes to changes induced by some external deity or other being. We are referring to change that is intrinsic to the entity. When we say change, we are referring to the change associated with certain entities. That is what we have discussed. Suppose human freedom for Hegel, changing economic conditions for Marx, social dynamics and knowledge for Comte, rise of democracy in the West for Tocqueville, and so on. Okay. We are referring to change that is intrinsic to the entity, to change that is held to be as much a part of the entity's nature as any purely structural element. Okay. Such change may require activation and nourishment from external agencies, just as does the growth in a plant or organism. But what is fundamental and guiding is nonetheless drawn from within the institution or culture. When we speak of growth, we have a reference to certain other attributes as well, to directionality. That is what we have discussed, change is directional, by which we mean that growth, unlike random changes, has trend or longitudinal shape. It moves, we say, from one point in time to another. Further, in such directional movement, it is cumulative. What is to be seen at any given moment is the cumulative result of all that has gone before in its life. And developmental change is something we also like to think of as irreversible, just as is growth in the biological being. Development has different stages, and these have genetic as well as merely sequential relation to one another, and finally growth or development has purpose. We may argue in the social world about just what the precise purpose is of a given development. The Marxists may see the purpose of human development as the final achievement of the classless society, with everything that has gone before to be seen as developmental cumulative preparation. Okay. We can you can look at closely related to the metaphor of growth. I mean, supporting it indeed is an analogy. Okay. This metaphor of growth, analogy. The analogy of cultural and social change to the growth manifested in the organism. This analogy can be seen as part of that wider one in which society as a whole, its structure and processes is declared to be organismic. But what Nisbet was trying to look at, the analogy of the life cycle in terms of civilization, in terms of Western history and so on. And of course, importantly, Spengler's The Decline of the West is extremely important. If the analogy were no more than the figure of speech, it so plainly is. If it were simply a rhetorical device, a play on words to enliven discourse, we could leave it at that. It would surely be worth no more than a footnote and so on. After all philosophers, historians like the rest of us are entitled to images and metaphors. Okay. Now, the principal argument that Nisbet is making here, that the metaphor of growth and the analogy. Okay. They are quite inseparable from some of the profoundest currents in Western thought on society and change. I mean, involved in premises, preconceptions regarding the nature of change, which we find in contemporary social theory. In the beginning was the axiom, society's likeness, its sameness indeed to the organism and its cycle of growth. Okay. The whole cyclical conception of cosmic and social development the framework of investigation of society and its changes, a framework built around such crucial concepts as origin, stages of growth, immanent cause, purpose and the like. Okay. Above all, there was the whole characteristically Greek and Roman conviction that reality, whether social, physical or biological, was to be conceived in terms of incessant ongoing change that was deemed to be as natural as a part of society as any element of structure. The theory of development arose in the first instance from what is today metaphor alone does not offset the possibility of being a correct body of theory of for the understanding of social change. Okay? That is why the metaphor as progress is going to be extremely important in this context. If you look at the metaphor as progress, I mean the idea of progress is the idea of progress, okay, is generally regarded as intellectual modernity. It is not therefore irony of the first water that its first formulation, I mean the formulation of progress, should occur in the context of a metaphor that was the very heart of the Augustinian view of mankind's development that goes back indeed to the classical age? No. Okay. The modern idea of progress with all its differences relating to the envisagement of the future rests in its main outline and content upon the identical analogy and metaphor that we have seen to underline. Okay. You can look at the works of Tocqueville and others, Nisbet and others, and then see what kind of expansion that the metaphor of growth or the metaphor as progress they have made. After the age of I mean if you look at it this way, that the idea of progress becomes widened in scope, moving from the accumulation of human knowledge to which it had been confined universally in the 17th century to an ever wider purview, one that before the 18th century was ended came to include governments, economies, social institutions of all types, even morality and human happiness. The concept of civilization became a vital one in the 18th century, a concept which was made to include manners as well as ideas, institutions as well as knowledge. The philosophers of the 18th century set the idea of progress. Okay, you can look at the works of Condorcet, you can look at the works of Krishan Kumar, Prophecy and Progress and so on. That is why I said the philosophers of the 18th century set the idea of progress ever more widely in the context of civilization rather than knowledge alone, just as in the 19th century the idea was cast in terms of society or culture. Okay. That is why I gave you the example of Leibniz and so on, how Comte was referring to Leibniz in the present, in the future and so on. Okay. How Leibniz declared that to comprehend the true fullness of perfection of nature, we must see it in terms of its potentiality as well as its actuality. Okay. What Leibniz was saying exactly what Herbert Spencer would say in the 19th century, and what in different wording Marx, Comte and many others would say, that given the principle of development of potentiality in unceasing drive towards actuality, progress and so on was what Spencer's what Nisbet tried to use Spencer's terms, which are precisely applicable to Leibniz, not an accident but a beneficent necessity. Okay. Leibniz said nothing else that would prove indispensable to the major developmentalists of the 18th and 19th centuries, including Charles Darwin. Nature, he wrote, never makes leaps. Okay? And that is what we have discussed in the last class also. Okay? And then what we generally find that it was Leibniz, with his immense philosophical prestige and his impeccable metaphysical style, who above any other single figure gave sanction to that most important attribute to growth applied to civilization, that is called continuity, if you look at this. It was in terms of this same proposition of continuity of growth in time that Leibniz also provided Western thought that with the formula for prediction of the future that it has followed right down to the present movement. In 1714, what Leibniz wrote in Principles of Nature and Grace. There he wrote that the present is big with the future might be read in the past, and the distant is expressed in the near. Nothing about the proposition is really novel, of course. It was in these terms that Aristotle and before him the pre-Socratics fused past, present and future. If civilization or any other or anything for that matter is indeed subject to the principles of growth, then it follows inexorably that the present is big with the future, just as the past was once pregnant with what is now actual in the present. Okay? If you look at this, then you will find that that Kant gave the idea of progress a mighty boost when, in reply to some exceedingly shrewd doubts on the matter expressed by Mendelssohn, when Kant wrote, I will therefore venture to assume that as the human race is continually advancing in civilization and culture as its natural purpose, so it is continually making progress for the better in relation to the moral end of its existence, and that this progress, although it may be sometimes interrupted, will never be entirely broken off or stopped. Okay? This is extremely important. Okay? If you look at the idea of progressive development is, this is the acceptance of the metaphor of growth and decay does not mean for Hume that human reason and observation can conclude anything definite with respect to progress or decline within the relatively short period of time that has been taken up by human history. Okay? And what Nisbet has been trying to do, he has been trying to look at progress, the idea of progress and the kind of degeneration it has happened. If you look at Social Change and History by Robert A. Nisbet, he has carried forward this aspect of progress and degeneration in three parts. Then you can look at this that there has been a constant pattern of rise and fall, of genesis and decay, of efflorescence and vicissitude of human cultures. It must still be uncertain whether at present it be advancing to its point of perfection or declining from it. Okay? The interferences to progress could be removed by wise legislation or enlightened despotism. The natural order of progressive development would take over. Okay? The same is true of Rousseau. What he said in Rousseau, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he said in his first Discourse, the name of the book is Discourse, the progression of argument on the arts and sciences and the corrupting influence they have had on man's character in history through the second discourse on equality, where he accounts for cultural corruption in terms of the rise of private property and artificial social inequality, through the third discourse on political economy to the great social contract. That is extremely important. It is a Marxist analysis of progress and degeneration. Okay? And major values seem to be in the process of corruption, a process caused by conditions that no more social reconstruction, even revolution, is likely to offset. There is a preoccupation with social dislocation of community, class, authority and sacred values that arises out of centuries old tendencies of centralization, levelings and secularization, where the progressive rationalist had tended to deprecate the crises and disorders in history, to see them, even as Marx and Spencer did, as necessary, if ugly, steps towards the new and good. The alienated philosophers saw these rather as wounds in the social organism which would not necessarily heal themselves. Okay? If you look at this from the perspective of equality, how equality liberates but also enchains in a new type of despotism that democracies alone have to face, and individualism emancipates but it also alienates in new forms of selfishness, spiritual isolation and insatiable restlessness. Secularism opens the mind to new worlds of conquest but steadily weakens the desire to prosecute them. Public opinion triumphs over the tyranny of princes but becomes itself a greater repression of individual thought than anything to be found in the Spanish Inquisition. Okay? Then if you what we have discussed in today's lectures, you will find that primarily we have discussed these 2 points: change is necessary and change proceeds from uniform causes. Then we have discussed how the metaphor of growth, the metaphor as progress, the modern idea of progress. Progress, okay, of the modern period is nothing but intellectual modernity. Okay? The expansion of metaphor and progress and degeneration. In the whole week, in the third week, in this week, we have discussed then classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress through the works of Hegel, Comte, Marx, Louis Morgan, Edward Teller, and the elements of social evolution, how change is natural, change is directional, change is immanent, change is continuous, change is necessary and change proceeds from uniform causes. And then the metaphor in terms of progress, after having discussed social change and evolution and social change, we have discussed in this week the metaphor of growth, the idea of progress through the metaphor of growth, the metaphor as progress, the modern idea of progress, intellectual modernism, the expansion of metaphor and progress and degeneration. What we are going to do in the next week, in the fourth, fifth and sixth week, we have divided modernization theory in 3 parts. Okay, we will be and the 7th week we will be discussing critiques of modernization theory. Okay, but please don't think that it will go in a unilateral way. It will modernization theory and critics of modernization theory will go side by side. Okay, you will find that we are going to discuss modernization theory. When I said the first sociological account of development was modernization theory, that postulates that the less developed economies would eventually catch up with development or industrialization, provided they emulated the economic and social system of Western capitalism. Okay, that is very important. Okay. And how it suffers from, I mean, how it is an oversimplistic version, how it is ethnocentric in nature, how to or what is categorically imperative on our part to bring about a critique of modernization theory, which is racist in nature, which is colonial in nature, which is imperialistic in nature, and then we will look at two approaches of the modernization theory in terms of critical variable approaches and the other dichotomous approaches, and there is a critique of, there is a threefold critique of the dichotomous approaches to modernization theory in terms of the ideological critique, the empirical critique, and the methodological or meta-theoretical critique. I mean, then from after this week, from the 4th week onward, 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th week, we will be discussing modernization theory and its critics. Okay? And then we will move on to dependency theory. Okay? Then from the next lecture, from the next week, we are going to start with modernization theory. Thank you.